All right, and we are live on Facebook. If you are watching it on Facebook, welcome to Poverty, Individuals and Communities, Perspectives from Jewish Law and Thought. We have the pleasure of learning today with Dr. Alyssa Gray. We will be learning on the topic of this week on the working poor and captives, trafficked persons, a closer look. This series is on the topic of economic inequality, which is not even an issue, but today the gaps between haves and have-nots is growing, as is the immiseration of those who can be described as living in poverty. A life of poverty can grind people down emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Poverty can render people vulnerable to manipulation by employers. It can be a cause and effect of tracking. And in this second class of a three-part series, we will examine how Hazal view poverty and its effects. We will also probe Jewish legal ideas about mitigating the emergence of a us and a them vis-a-vis the poor. Thank you if you are joining on Facebook or on Zoom. Welcome. Please feel encouraged to ask questions in chat. It will be monitored. I'm also, for people on Zoom, I'm also sending out panel invitations. These are a great way to first, if you want to see or show your face, you have to accept. It also means you can ask questions without having to ask permission to ask questions. And with that, I just want to give people 1 or 2 minutes to, join in, get their screen set up. But it's a pleasure to have Dr. Gray with us this evening. Source sheets will be posted in chat in both Facebook and Grisha Live momentarily. Feel free to follow along, although they are shared on screen. And with that, Dr. Gray, it's good to see you.
Nice to see you. Thank you. I'm happy to be with people in Facebook land, Zoom land again today. Today in our second class, we're going to look more closely at two groups. A group that I've called the working poor, or it might be more accurate to call them the poor who work, or the people who remain poor despite the fact that they work. That's one group. And then the other group being shvuyim, captives. The reason that I'm looking at these two groups is not at all to imply that they're identical or even necessarily overlapping, but to show that the poor, as we spoke about them last week on November 3rd, where the poor seem to be an undifferentiated group. I mean, there's a common vocabulary. We talked a bit about the vocabulary, aniyim, the poor. There are other terms. It seems to be an undifferentiated group. In fact, no. And proper attention to what it is that Hazal, our sages, and the post-Talmudic scholars have to say about poverty and the poor requires attention to a more granular description of who these people actually are. When it comes to the working poor, and again, I'm not necessarily crazy about that locution, but for purposes of verbal economy, and it's what's on the source sheet, we'll keep going with it. It's important to see also that not only do they illustrate how the poor are sort of not an undifferentiated large group, but the lines blur. In other words, you have people in different walks of rabbinic life, as it were, who are portrayed as poor, and people that are poor in one circumstance and who are connected to people who work in another circumstance. So in other words, the poor shouldn't be simply thought of as this large group consisting of people who take tzedakah, who take charity, but they cut across different other categories. So without further ado, let's take a look at sources 1 and 2 here on the sheet, starting with source 1, Mishnah Peah 5:6. Here it's a longer Mishnah. I pulled out this particular line. Lo yiskor adam et hapoalim, a person should not hire workers al menat she'yilaked beno acharav, on the condition that the son should glean after them. And here, the point that I want to illustrate very simply is the overlap between the category of the poor who goes out, who is entitled to collect payah, entitled to collect the corners of the field, which is one of the biblical statutory matnot aniyim, gifts to the poor. But there's this overlap between this category of the poor and the worker. These are not two separate categories. I should point out also that this line of the Mishnah is part of the larger Mishnah, which also talks about other ways that the owner of the field should not engage in behaviors that distinguish, or more accurately, I should say, discriminate between different groups of the poor. The owner of the field is not permitted to favor one poor person or group of the poor over the other, is not permitted to permit some people to glean corners of the fields and not permit others to glean. An owner of the field who does that is called a gozel et ha'aniyim, somebody literally who robs the poor. But again, this little line fits into that. One shouldn't be favoring the person that one hires to work in the field by allowing their child to glean after them. But again, my point here being the simple one that there is this overlap, that people who work are not necessarily therefore on a straight highway, a straight path out of poverty, that these people are within the category of the poor. The second source is rather colorful. About the sage Hillel, the story of Hillel being, shall we say, a bit of a Hillel-sicle, a bit of a frozen Hillel. This source in the Babylonian Talmud in Yoma 35b is part of an extended sequence of Agadah, of non-legal material, which is designed to do away and undercut excuses that people might have for not studying Torah. You think you're too rich to study Torah. You say on the one, at the one extreme, on the one hand, that your possessions require all your time and attention. You can't devote any time to studying Torah. Well, look at the example of X. X is an example of a very wealthy person who nevertheless was able to study Torah. Here, Hillel, of course, is an example of the opposite extreme. You think you're too poor to study Torah. Here is the example of Hillel. Look what happened to Hillel. Look at the dire circumstances his poverty put him in, and nevertheless, he was able to study Torah. That, of course, is the larger context of the source. There are some details here that are worth attending to, which is why I've brought the source. They said about Hillel the elder, now I'm looking at the text inside, that each and every day he would work, haya oseh, literally he would do things, umistaker, and he would earn a wage, but tarpik. He would earn a tarpik, a denomination of currency, a half dinar. Chetzio haya noten l'shomer beit hamidrash. He would give half his wage to the guard at the door of the Beit HaMidrash, the house of study, v'chetzio lefarnasato ulefarnasat anshe beito, and the other half he would use to support himself and his family. Well, one day, this is the lot of the poor. As we learned last week, Batar Ania Azla Aniyuta, poverty follows after the poor. Sometimes that cycle of poverty is something that a person gets caught up in and finds it difficult to get out of. Pa'amachat lo matzah lehistaker. It once happened that Hillel on a given day did not find work. Hillel was unable to find day labor on a given day. And what happened below hinicho shomer beit hamidrash lehikanes. He therefore did not have the half dinar that he would normally use to enter the Beit HaMidrash, and the guard didn't let him enter. What did he do? He climbed up to the roof, suspended himself, and he sat at the edge of the arubah, the skylight, in order to listen to what was being said down below. Truly very enterprising. And the source says, what is it that he wanted to hear? To hear the divrei Elohim Chayim, the words of the living God from Shemaiah and Avtalion, two of the great sages of that generation. Now, at this point, the scene shifts a little bit from Hillel on the top, on the roof, listening in at the skylight, to down below. It turned out that that day happened to be Erev Shabbat. It was Friday. It also happened to be Tkufat Tevet, the season of Tevet, the time of winter. When it gets dark earlier, it's the winter, and snow began to fall. So it was Erev Shabbat, and poor Hillel was up there this whole time, and it's snowing on him and snowing on him. And the next morning at dawn, at Alot HaShachar, at the break of dawn, which is the day of Shabbat, Shemaiah says to Avtalion, in essence, is it dark here or is it just me? What's going on around here? Why it's supposed to be normally this time of day, it should be very bright in here. Why is it so dark? Maybe it's a Yom HaMe'unan, maybe it's a cloudy day. And then the two of them look up and they can make out the image, a human image in the skylight. They go up there, they find poor Hillel, they extract him. And again, keep in mind, it's Shabbat. So they extract him, then they take him downstairs, they wash him, they anoint him, they put him by the bonfire, presumably in order to help Hillel out and to thaw him out. They're engaging in some behaviors that, strictly speaking, violate Shabbat. But of course, Hillel appears to be in dire straits. And then Amru, they say, and this is the last line of the story, Ra'ui ze lechalel alav et haShabbat. This one, Hillel, is worthy to have Shabbat desecrated on his behalf. The literary person in me can't help but point out that lechalel at the end of the story is a play on Hillel. The rabbis frequently make plays on the letter He versus the letter Chet in some of their expositions. And here he is, Hillel is Ra'ui, is appropriate, it is fitting that we desecrate lechalel et haShabbat. Now, there are a few things we want to notice here. One is that Hillel is clearly described as an impoverished person. He earns a half dinar a day, and he would subdivide that between sustenance for himself and his family and the Beit HaMidrash. But what's interesting is that he's described as working. He is not described as supporting himself and his family from tzedakah. He is described as working. Secondly, we should also notice the story refers to a shomer Beit HaMidrash. There was a guard in front of the house of study. Those who were here or saw the presentation from last week and or the source sheet will remember that Brachot 28a, another source that we looked at, also refers to a shomer hapetach, a guard at the entrance of the Beit HaMidrash. So what is the significance of these details? First of all, the fact that Hillel is said to work. This ties into some broader issues about how the Talmud Bavli considers work and the poor and tzedakah and rabbis. But it is very interesting that he is described as working, because the Talmud Bavli does tend to present, on the whole, warmer portrayals of the working poor than it does the poor who support themselves through tzedakah. I realize that this is a large claim that I'm sort of rolling out in the middle of the room and kind of walking away from, but it is a very interesting and characteristic pattern. He is presented here as working, the working poor in the Talmud Bavli specifically, and I'm being quite precise in referring to the Talmud Bavli, are typically presented in this warmer way. Secondly, Hillel is, of course, a sage. He's a foundational sage, but he is a sage of Eretz Yisrael. The Talmud Bavli rarely, not never, but rarely portrays native Babylonian sages as being poor, impoverished, in need. Again, not never, but rarely. So it's very interesting that Hillel in the land of Israel is presented in this way. And what's also interesting is the portrayal of the class issues involved with access to study. And this is why also I brought up Brachot 28a from last week, which had also mentioned how Rabban Gamliel, the patriarch, had a shomer hapetach, a guard at the gate of the Beit HaMidrash. This story is bringing together these class issues in study, the fact that study appears to be something that is limited. You have to pay. It may be for some people an amount that they don't think twice about. For someone else like Hillel, the way he's portrayed in the story, it is an amount that he has to think twice about, because the same amount of money that he uses to enter the Beit HaMidrash is the amount of money he uses to support himself and his family. So these class issues are present, and notice the ambivalence of the story about these class issues. At the end, Hillel is brought down, he behaves heroically, he's brought into the Beit HaMidrash. Shemaiah and Avtalion say that he's worthy to desecrate Shabbat but nevertheless, we don't, and it's perhaps unfair for me to put this weight on this one particular story, but we don't get any indication that anything is going to change. There is an ambivalence about the interpenetration of these class issues with Torah study, but nothing necessarily is going to change. So again, from sources 1 and 2, just what I want to flag for us is this idea that the poor are not an undifferentiated group. There are overlaps. There are the working poor. The poor even may intersect, in the Bavli's view, the world of the sages, at least the sages of Eretz Yisrael. And we do have to keep in mind that accurately assessing the place of the poor in the world of the sages requires attentiveness to these overlaps. Sources 3 through 8 take us more deeply into the world of the poor who work. And here I want to echo the idea I mentioned last week of just sort of thinking of some of the big questions, just keeping some meta issues in mind as we approach these sources. Before we enter into sources 3 through 8, what is it that we're seeing here? What is it that the sages want us to see? And I'll suggest a couple of things, and we'll see how these play themselves out. Number one, that working for a wage may very well not be a way out of poverty. That working for a wage may, in fact, not only not be a way out of poverty, but it may be indicative of how people remain in poverty. Apropos, a second point, to pay attention to how the sages are focused on the power differentials between employers on the one hand, whether they be called householders, ba'alei habayit, or there's some other term, but householders on the one hand, and the workers, the people who work from them on the other hand, and how these power differentials manifest themselves in workers' anxiety about receiving their wages. And then thirdly, a small point that we'll deal with in the latter part of our treatment today of the working poor, or what about differentiations among workers? We're so far differentiating between the poor writ large and the working poor as a subgroup within the poor, but what about the working poor, people who may do different things, who may have different skill sets, who may earn different wages? How do those differences, if at all, manifest themselves? So again, these are just some things to keep an eye on as we begin to look at this material. Starting with source 3, which we'll take on its own, we'll then look at sources 4 and 5 in tandem together with each other. The source 3 comes from the Sifrei Deuteronomy, the Tannaitic Midrash from the book of Deuteronomy, the 3rd or 4th century. The verse is Deuteronomy 32:4, El Emunah v'ein avel, about God. El Emunah, God is a faithful God. The Midrash says, Baal HaPikadon, God is reliable. God guards the security deposit. God doesn't steal it. Ve'ein avel, God is never false. Goveh shalo ba'achrona, shalo kimidat basar vadam. We immediately get into a comparison of God with human beings, which redounds to the credit of God and the detriment of human beings. God collects what is God's own last, not the way a person does. Well, what is going on here? We then get a mashal, a parable. Poel she'asa etzel bal habayit. We have a worker who is working for a householder, and the worker already owes the householder money. So the worker has already at some point borrowed money from the householder, owes the householder money, and then goes to work for a wage. Kishahu bali tolet scharo, when he goes to get his wage from the householder, Omer lo, the householder says to him, Say dinar sheyesh li biadcha v'helecha et hashar. What does the householder say? I'm going to deduct what you owe me from your wage. You can have the rest. So you did a day's work, you've earned a wage, but you owe me money. I'm going to deduct what you owe me and you can get the rest. Aval, but, says the Midrash, God is not like that. God puts God's own interests last. God will pay a person what it is that the person is owed up front, and God will put God's own interests last. What we learn from this, I'm less interested in what we learn about God or the Midrash's view of God than what it is that we learn about the Midrash's view of the householder who employs the day laborer. The idea that this is ripped from the headlines of the Midrash's world, that the householder will attempt to do this. The person is working, presumably they need the wage. Again, think of the story of poor Icy Hillel. The wage is going to go on a daily basis. This is living hand to mouth, paycheck to paycheck, as it were, to support the family. And the householder says, oh, by the way, you owe me money. I'm going to deduct that. One can imagine a scenario in which the worker ends up with nothing for what it is that they worked for that day. Sources 4 and 5 are parallel sources. It's basically an example of the same story found in the two Talmuds. Source 4 from Yerushalmi Bava Metzia and source 5 from Bavli Bava Metzia. The stories are found structurally in the same place in the two Talmuds, which is a noteworthy and common phenomenon. And what I want us to do is, we're looking at these stories, I want us to think about what is it that is similar and different between the two stories. Are the two stories really saying exactly the same things, or what is the one emphasizing that the other is not? So in the Yerushalmi story, we have a character named Rabbi Nehemiah Kadar, Rabbi Nehemiah the pot maker, the potter. What did he do? He gave pots to a person who broke them. I mean, accidents happen. What did he do? Arim gulte. To compensate himself, Rabbi Nehemiah Kadar took the person's coat. The person wasn't happy. He went to Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina, who said to him, go back to Rabbi Nehemiah Kadar and quote Proverbs chapter 2, verse 20 to him. What does that say? It says, Lama'an telech b'derech tovim, that you should go in the ways of good people. Go back to him, quote that verse. The guy went, quoted the verse to Rabbi Nehemiah Kadar, and got his coat back. At this point, presumably there's another, the guy goes back to Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina, who says, wait, did he pay your wages? And the guy said, no, he didn't. He said, go back to him, quote him the rest of Proverbs chapter 2, verse 20, which says, V'orchot tzadikim tishmor, and you shall keep to the paths of the just. And the guy did this, and he went, and Rabbi Nehemiah Kadar paid his wages. Now, again, the Bavli story is similar, but interestingly different in some details. Here, instead of one person who broke a pot, we have Hanahu Shakolai. We have some porters. We have more than one person. Here we have a different sage. I'm actually not, it's work for another day. Why, if at all, that is important, but we have a group of people. Again, they broke some of his wine barrels. What did he do? Shakal leglimayaho, as Rabbi Nehemiah does in the Yerushalmi, he took their cloaks. At this point, they went and they complained to a sage named Rav, and Rav talks directly to the other scholar. The the porters are not an intermediary. Rav talks to the other scholar and says, return to them their cloaks. The other scholar, whose wine barrels are broken, is astounded. He says, Dina hachi, is this the law? Yes. He quotes Proverbs chapter 2, verse 20. At that point, the porters themselves pipe up. And what do they say? We hear the voice of the poor, which is not to be taken for granted. In rabbinic sources and medieval Jewish sources, we don't always hear the voice of the poor. Here we get at least the rabbi's representation of the voice of the poor. Aniye anan, we are poor people. V'tarchinan kule yoma, we worked hard all day. V'kafinan, and we're really hungry. V'letlan midei, and we don't have anything. At this point, Rav says to the rabbi whose barrels were broken, pay them their wage. And again, the rabbi whose barrels were broken says, what, Dina Hachi? Is that really the halacha? And he says to him, yes, quoting again the latter part of Proverbs 2:20, V'orchot tzadikim tishmor, keep the path of the righteous. The 2 points that I really want us to notice, or 3 points actually. First of all, in the Bavli story, we're dealing with a collectivity. We're dealing with a group of people. Secondly, here we're dealing with a rabbi who asks, is this the law? And he gets the answer, in effect, it is the law. In the Yerushalmi, we're not being told it's the law. It seems to be, one might say, a superlative demonstration of ethical behavior based on the book of Proverbs, but it's not being represented as the law that the person who suffered damage at the hands of a worker should have to not only return their cloak, but also pay them a wage. In the Bavli, this is being presented as the deen. And then, of course, the point that we saw most clearly, the fact that in the Yerushalmi story, yes, the poor person is the go-between between the two rabbis. In the Bavli story, the two rabbis interact directly, but we hear a rabbinic representation of the voice of the poor and what really is at stake for them. It's not simply, oh, I want the wage, I want my cloak back, but look at the straitened circumstances of our lives. We're poor, we worked hard all day, we're really hungry, and we don't have anything, which is a really sort of stunning representation by the rabbis of their perception of the life of the poor. In sources 6 through 8, we're dealing with really elaborations of considerations drawn from Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 15. It pays for a moment just to consider the verse, which I have in front of me here in the Hebrew and in the JPS translation. I'll just focus quickly on the JPS translation because there's a phrase in the verse that might seem to be redundant, but of course, in the rabbinic view, the Torah is the divine speech. Nothing can be redundant. So what may seem redundant to us is in fact not redundant. 24:15 in Deuteronomy says, you must pay him, the worker, his wages on the same day before the sun sets, for he is needy and urgently depends on it. Else he will cry to Adonai against you and you will incur guilt. I realize this is all oral at the moment, so it may be hard to follow, but let me just point something out. Were I so inclined, I could rewrite the verse to be a little more economical in its language. I could rewrite the verse to say, you must pay him his wage on the same day before the sun sets, for he is needy. Else he will cry to the Lord against you and you will incur guilt. The phrase that the worker urgently depends upon it, or in Hebrew, ve'elav, and to it, who nosei et nafsho, literally he raises up his life, he's giving his life for this wage. That phrase sort of seems to be redundant. And this is what the Midrash and the Bavli are going to probe. So we'll start here in source 6. We're back to the Sifrei Deuteronomy, the Tannaitic Midrash to the book of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy 24:15. You must pay him his wages on the same day before the sun sets. He's needy and urgently depends upon it. Else he will cry to the Lord against you and you will incur guilt. It starts with, okay, a nighttime laborer collects all day. We'll be returning to that. But what I want to point to is where the Midrash goes, roughly in the middle of the translation paragraph, for he urgently depends on it. And I pointed out in parentheses, literally it says he sets his life on it, no say it nafsho. And the Midrash asks a rhetorical question. For what did this laborer go up a ramp? In other words, put himself in a dangerous situation potentially and hand his life over to you. Why did he do this? Umasar lecha et nafsho. Why did he hand his life over to you? Was he doing it for the fresh air? Was he doing it for exercise? Was he doing it for his convenience? No, it was shetiten lo scharo, so that you should give him his wage. If so, why does the Torah say he urgently depends upon it? What the Midrash is pointing out is the seeming redundancy of that phrase. Of course, a worker is going to work and is potentially even going to, if need be, put himself in dangerous situations in order to earn the wage. In our slang, he's not doing it for his health. He's doing it in order to earn a wage. So if that's the case, then what is the meaning of this seemingly redundant phrase, the elav hu nosei et nafsho? And for the wage, he is handing over his life. Of course, he's handing over his life. Rather, Ella Milamed, this phrase comes to teach, Shakol HaKovesh Sachar Sachir, that whatever employer crushes, suppresses the wage of a hired person, Ma'ale Alav HaKatuv, scripture accounts it to him, Ke'ilu hu notel et nafsho, as if he took the person's life. So the person is doing work and handing their life over to you potentially in order to do the work. If you then suppress the wage, fail to pay the wage in a timely fashion, you are no-tailing, you are taking that person's life. And this is a very stark image of the potential for danger, for violence in this particular type of relationship. The person is putting their life on the line potentially, and if you fail to pay on time, you in fact are taking their life. The Talmud Bavli in source 7 in Bava Metzia 112a builds on this midrash in the Sifrei Deuteronomy. We could see it begins again, ve'elav hu nosei et nafsho, for he sets his soul upon it, the wage. We see something similar here in the Bavli to what we saw in the Sifrei. For what did he ascend a ramp or suspend himself from a tree or risk death to himself? Was it not for his wages? And then we get another interpretation that we saw in the Sifrei. He sets his soul upon it. One who withholds the wages is as if the person takes the worker's soul from him. And then we get a machloket, a dispute, a disagreement between Rav Huna and Rav Chisda. We had said, the Midrash had said, and the Bavli repeats it, that it's as if he took one's soul. In fact, the pronouns are a bit ambiguous. So far, we, following the Midrash, have been understanding that the employer who suppresses the wage is taking the worker's soul, but in fact, the ambiguity invites some investigation. So one of these sages, Rav Huna or Rav Chisda, says it's not the worker's soul who is taken, the soul of the person who was robbed by not having been paid the wage, but it's the soul of the employer which is taken. The employer, by suppressing the wage, loses her own soul. It's her soul which is taken, she being the robber, a robber because she has taken the wage. And it's interesting to ponder these two perspectives. The one who says it is the soul of the robber, in other words, the one who says that it's the employer who in fact is losing her own soul, has taken her own soul by depriving the worker of the wage. This is based upon two verses in the book of Proverbs, verses 22 and 23 of chapter 22. And the one who says it refers to the soul of the worker, who here is the robbery victim, bases it on Proverbs chapter 1, verse 19. I'm less interested right now in the details of looking at the verses, which are very interestingly interpreted along this line, but the analogy being made between the robber In this case, then the employer who suppresses the wage, who is called a robber, no different than any other robber, no different than someone who pulls a weapon and tries to extract money or property by force, like any other robbery. So the analogy there on the one hand, and the analogy between the robbery victim, the nigzal, and the worker whose wage has been suppressed. Again, if the wage has been suppressed, this makes this person no less a victim of robbery than if they were approached with force and violence in a dark alley at some point and told to hand over money or property. Then, of course, what the Bavli does is what the sages typically do. You have Rabbi A relying on certain verses, Rabbi B relying on other verses. The Bavli can't help but ask the question, well, Rabbi A relied on certain verses. What would Rabbi A make of Rabbi B's verses? And Rabbi B had relied on certain verses. What would Rabbi B make of Rabbi A's verses? And what's interesting here to us is the fact that the verse that was used to talk about the taking of the soul of the robbery victim, the soul of the robbery victim is then applied to the soul of the robber, the cheating employer. The fact that they spoiled the worker by not giving them the wage results then in God spoiling them because they took someone's soul. And again, all of this ultimately going back to Deuteronomy 24:15 and the idea of the Torah already planting the idea that the worker is giving their soul for the wage, that the worker is basically putting their life on the line and doing what they're doing for the wage, and the rabbis playing all of this out. Source 8 continues with this theme in a little bit of a different way. Here we're back to the issue of the time limits to pay workers, which I sort of footnoted in a previous source. From where do we know that a day worker, a worker hired by day, a schir yom, a day laborer, can collect his wages all night, the night following the day that he worked? And we have a verse for that. From where do we know that a night worker, a schir laila, someone hired to work all through the night, can collect the wage all of the next day? And here, this really amounts to what the time limit is for the employer. So the employer hires someone to work during the day. The employer has until dawn the next day to pay the wage. The worker hired someone to work during the night. The employer has the entire next day to pay the wage. The question, of course, what happens after that? So let's say the employer is indifferent to the fact that he will be violating Torah law. He doesn't meet the deadline. What happens then? Said Rav, he transgresses Bal Tisheh. You shall not delay payment. In other words, there is a continuing violation of a negative commandment. There is a continuing violation even after the scriptural deadline is missed. There's a continuing violation. And Rav Yosef is a little bit astonished. Where is that? We're talking about verses in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. There's no Bal Tisheh. There's no generalized prohibition against delaying the wage there. Where does this come from? And Rav Yosef grounds Rav's point in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 28. You cannot say to your friend, Al tomar l'reacha, lech vasho b'machar etain. You cannot say to your friend, go, come again, tomorrow I will give, v'yesh itach, when you have it with you. Proverbs being invoked here to show this sort of dismissive, cruel behavior that these Babylonian rabbis add on to the Torah's own prohibitions. The Torah is seen as focusing on the immediate deadline, the day worker, when do you have to pay him? The night worker, when do you have to pay him? The Babylonian rabbis reaching into the book of Proverbs to establish that the negligent employer who flouts the Torah's prohibitions and continues to flout them, this type of cruel, dismissive behavior that you have the wage and you just keep putting the person off, I'll give it to you, come back tomorrow, is a continuing violation. Sources 9, 10, and 11 deal more with the third of the issues that I flagged at the beginning about differentials in the group of workers. Namely, what do you do about different sorts of workers? I mean, are they, just as we really can't put the quote unquote poor into one undifferentiated group, we shouldn't necessarily put all workers in one undifferentiated group. Here, I'm not going to go into detail in source 9, the details here of the Talmud Bavli, except to say the following. The Mishnah here in Avodah Zarah, page 62a, is very clear that any worker who earns a wage by doing any sort of work with libation wine from which a libation had been poured out to an idol, cannot collect their wage. It's a penalty. The prohibition against engaging with idolatry is so severe that even though the worker has earned the wage, he cannot get the wage. The wage is forbidden. However, and then the analogy is brought, well, what about sabbatical year produce? Produce of the sabbatical year is not supposed to become a subject of commerce. One isn't supposed to say, I'm opening up my pop-up during the Shemitah year to sell sabbatical year produce. No. So what happens if you have day laborers who, and again, people aren't working for their health or for exercise, they're working in order to earn a wage. What is it? Can the person keep the wage? And Bavli Avodah Zarah, and then this is spelled out more by the Rambam in the 12th century, is clear that it depends who we're talking about. If we're talking about the type of workers who are more specialized, ass drivers, the chamarim, they're more specialized, they will be penalized. If they do work with sabbatical year produce, they will be penalized. But day laborers, poalim, workers who work on a day-to-day basis, they are not specialized. The work that they do generally will not earn them a larger wage, even though it's not a good thing that they're making a market in sabbatical year produce. We are not going to penalize them by depriving them of their wage. And this point is made more clearly by the Rambam in source 10, where he says, and he adds a little flourish of his own. It's not an original thought, but it's an original expression of the thought. And he says in the latter part of the Hebrew, "Umipnei ma kansu b'schar hachamarim," why did they, the sages, penalize the donkey drivers, "v'lo kansu b'schar hapoel," and they didn't penalize the worker's wage? Mipnei shescharo ma'at lo kansu bo, says the Rambam. Because the day laborer's wage is very small, they did not penalize him. Mishum kedei chayav. That is an addition of the Rambam. They didn't penalize him because of the needs of his life, because of what he needs to be sufficient for his life. Donkey drivers earn a bigger wage. If they lose their sabbatical year wage, they can get another wage. The day laborer, as we saw in the little example of Hillel, they could come that there's a day that they're unable to find day labor. Nevertheless, they still need to support themselves and their family. If the only day labor they can come across is transacting business, commerce, and sabbatical year produce, this is something that they need, in the Rambam's words, kedei chayav, for purposes of their lives. The Rambam's commentator in the 16th century, the Radbaz, Rabbi David ibn Zimra, makes the comment here on the Rambam. He says, "V'kashyali," this is difficult to me. And the Rambam, building on the Gemara, is making a distinction between the donkey drivers on the one hand and the poalim, the day laborers, on the other. He says, this is difficult to me. Uman lemalan, who can say to us, the katafi nami enam kedei chayehem? Who is to say that porters, people like the chamarim, specialized workers, that they also don't have a concern of kedei chayehem, what they need for the needs of their lives. In other words, what kind of distinction are we making here? How come their concerns about livelihood and supporting their family is somehow less worthy to be considered than that of the poalim? And then the Radbaz answers his own question, which is, of course, reaffirming the ruling of the Rambam. V'yesh lomar, one must say, distam poel, that the unspecified laborer, again, the person who is not specialized, who does not have a particular skill or craft, the day laborer who relies on whatever jobs he can pick up on a given day to support himself and his family, the unspecified laborer, el scharo hu nosei nafsho. Notice how the Radbaz picks up on the language of Deuteronomy 24:13. The unspecified day laborer, he sets his life upon his wage. Masha ein kain b'chamarim u'b'chatafim, which is not the case with donkey drivers and with porters. In other words, they may have money in the bank. They're not living for a daily wage. They're not living, as it were, paycheck to paycheck. So if they are penalized as to their wage because they earned it trafficking in sabbatical year produce, they can afford it. They may not like it, but they can afford it. But the unspecified poel, the stam poel, this is the person who is living paycheck to paycheck, who needs that daily job. Every penny that this person earns is kedei chayav. For the purposes of his life, for the purposes of his livelihood, and therefore the rabbis will not allow this person to be penalized for transacting in sabbatical year produce, even though it really is not something that should be done. With sources 12 and 13, I'm pointing to something in the Talmuds and later treatment of the poel, which is very interesting. It's a topic that could be an hour at least on its own, but I just want to flag it. Here we're sort of shifting gears and shifting our lens in one particular way. The sages look at the working poor. And it begins here with Kiddushin 22b in source 12, which actually has nothing at all to do with workers. This is about the slave who decides in the book of Exodus that he is not going to leave his master when his period of indentured servitude is up. He says, I love my master, I'm going to stay with my master. And the Torah says that his ear is to be bored into the door. So the question is, why the ear? What is going on here? So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai used to interpret this verse. Why was the ear singled out? Why was the slave, the Eved Ivri, who doesn't want to go free, why is this slave to be bored through in the ear? And the answer is, it is a kind of a penalty, because God said, this ear, Ozen, Sheshama Koli al Har Sinai, this ear that heard my voice on Har Sinai, when I said in Leviticus, Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim, the children of Israel are slaves to me, to Adonai. V'lo avadim la'avadim, they are not slaves to slaves, meaning to other human beings. And this person doesn't want to go free, let that ear be bored. So the ear that heard God give human freedom fundamentally to all people, and who is willingly rejecting it, that rejection is symbolized by this ritual in the book of Exodus of having the ear bored. So what does this have to do with anything related to Poalim? A partial answer comes from source 13, which is Bava Kama 116b. There is also relevant material, not much of it, in the Talmud Yerushalmi. There's also another place in the Bavli.
Excuse me, Dr. Gray, do you mind scrolling? You've been on source 2 for the last couple of sources.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. Just wanted to flag it to you.
That's what happens when you have your own in front of you. Thank you. Wow, this does look like a lot of scrolling, doesn't it? Okay, thank you very much. That's why we have Kayla. Great. Okay, so where this goes next, as I said, in source 13, We have Bava Kama 116b. Again, there isn't much other material in the Talmudic sources. There is some. It does become a major issue in post-Talmudic literature. And again, that's proverbially work for another day. But notice what Rav does here. Rav, the early Babylonian Amora, says, Poel yachol lachazor bo afilu b'chatzi hayom. A laborer, a day laborer, is entitled to withdraw from the job even in the middle of the day, halfway through the day. And what is the reason for that? And here we go again to the same Leviticus 25:55 that figured into Kiddushin and the discussion of the Eved Ivri who does not want freedom. Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim v'lo avadim la'avadim. The Midrash on the verse says, the children of Israel are slaves to me, to Adonai. They are not, in essence, slaves, to other human beings. And notice how Rav uses this. It's actually quite a radical ruling based on a very thin read of a verse. I mean, there is really not much in the verse that would cause one to expect that you would go from this kind of elevation of human dignity to the idea that the poel can walk off the job in the middle of the day. But the key takeaway for us right now is that Hazal, the sages, are very anxious to break any possible analogy and to completely separate the category of wage labor from slavery. The fact that they're so anxious to trouble that analogy is because they probably are very rightfully concerned in their time and place that that analogy is all too easy to come by. A slave may work in the fields, the day laborer who earns a wage may work in the fields. The slave may do various tasks, many of which may not require a specialized training, so may the poel. Nevertheless, the poel is not a slave. Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim. God says the children of Israel are slaves to me. V'lo avadim la'avadim. The worker has this dignity. Rav allows that dignity to be performed by being able to walk off the job in the middle of the day. At this point, we're turning to the issue of captives, the shivuyim, and in the title page, the first page of the source sheet, I put in as well the word trafficked persons, because I think sometimes we hear the term shivuyim, captives, and pidyon shivuyim, the redemption of captives, and we tend to think in terms of the past. And I wish it were true that we were thinking only in terms of the past, but this scourge, this human atrocity continues to today. The reason that I'm bringing up this category of person in the here and now is because this is a category of person where there is total vulnerability. And that is a point that the few sources that I've assembled here are trying to make. There is total vulnerability, not quote unquote simply the economic vulnerability of the poel, but a complete vulnerability. Here I commend to your attention source 14, which is a lyrical passage from the Rambam's Laws of Gifts to the Poor 8:10, where he describes how redeeming captives is actually greater than tzedakah. He does not invent that idea. It comes from the Bavli in Masechet Bava Batra, but what is unique to the Rambam here is how he expresses it. Redeeming captives, providing them with clothing, is a greater mitzvah. Why? A captive basically is poor plus. The captive is among those who are hungry, thirsty, and unclothed. The captive is besakanat nefashot, in danger of his life. If someone pays no attention to his redemption, in other words, a person who is in a position to help, but doesn't notice the laundry list of negative commandments that the Rambam says the person violates, Deuteronomy 15:7, Leviticus 19:16, 19:18, Deuteronomy 15:8, it goes on and on. on. There is no mitzvah as great as the redemption of captives. But again, notice his stress on the absolute vulnerability of the captive. The captive is hungry, among the hungry, re'evim, among the thirsty, tzmeim, among the naked, the arumim, and is in danger of life. This is echoed in source 15 by the early modern respondent in response Binyamin Ze'ev, where he echoes some of that language. And he says, donation for the purpose of redeeming captives is preferable to tzedakah. Again, channeling what is in the Talmud Bavli, what is in the Rambam. And notice he echoes the Rambam, the captive stands in constant danger of the sword. Constant danger of the sword, sakanat cherev, sakanat ra'av, is hungry and is naked, and the one who saves him from all of these things, this is a great thing. Notice the distinction then that Binyamin Ze'ev makes between the captive who is completely vulnerable. They've been ripped out of their environment, they've been ripped out of their home, so they have all of the tragedies of poverty, plus the fact that they are disoriented and completely vulnerable. And he says, the one who redeems him saves him from all these things. You're not just saving the captive from the immediate concern about food and clothing, but from all of these things, from a total sense of insecurity, which is not the case, he says, for the one who sustains a poor person in the home. Hamifarnes ani babayit. The poor person who lives in their home, it's not that it's a great thing to be a poor person living in the home, but that person has a base level of security that the shavui, that the captive lacks. Source 16, we're still in response Binyamin Ze'ev, Siman 231. And here I just find this interesting, aside from the fact that the Shulchan Aruch in the 16th century also codifies this ruling.
Could you scroll up again? You're talking about source 16 now?
Sorry, yes.
Okay, thank you.
As I should have somebody sitting next to me whose job it is to scroll. Sorry, that's what happens when I print off my own material. I forget. Apologies. So Binyamin Ze'ev, here also what he says, which I just find in a way kind of amusing, the question he's dealing with, sort of the theoretical question is, if the mitzvah of redeeming captives really is so great, how come in Tractate Megillah, when we're given the list of reasons for which we can sell a Torah scroll, and selling a Torah scroll for other purposes is not a favored thing to do. He said, how come redeeming captives isn't on that list? How come it's not one of the things for which you could sell a Torah scroll? And when I kind of I have to confess, I put this here because I just find it sort of amusing in a certain type of rabbinic logic that you see elsewhere. He says, because it's so obvious. Why didn't the Talmud and Tractate Megillah say that we can sell a Torah scroll to redeem captives? It said we could sell a Torah scroll to finance Torah study for a wedding. It doesn't say captives because it was so obvious it didn't need to be said. Obviously, he says, whoever sustains a Jewish life is as if he sustained an entire world. And here he folds in a well-known Mishnah from Tractate Sanhedrin, about how one who saves one life is as if they saved the whole world. This, of course, is another topic about which we could go on at length, but it's so obvious, he says. Of course, the Talmud doesn't have to repeat this priority in every single possible place. It's so absolutely obvious that this is the case, because by redeeming the captive, one is saving an entire world. So I would say among the things you learned today by my not scrolling is the power of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the power of oral Torah, its strengths and limitations, how difficult it is to follow along orally. But I do think we do have a couple of minutes if there are any questions or comments.
I don't know. I guess I'm just thinking about, because of how the way you structured the class, of the contrast between are someone who is poor versus someone who is a slave, and and how why do we say certain things about one category and the other? And some of it might be because I guess poverty is kind of the way I looking at these sources. Poverty is something that is here, and you can play whack-a-mole with it, but something will change. And slavery is more. It's usually some external. Like it's not like you had a bad harvest or a bad year or a bad whatever. It's like someone came and took you. I think I'm not exactly holding in ancient Near East, labor practices.
Yeah.
So I may be wrong.
Yeah, well, I would say neither am I holding in ancient Near East practices, but you did put your finger on something that I do think about, which is to what extent do the rabbis see some of these situations as fixable, and in what respects do they see people as trapped in a cycle that it almost becomes a status? It goes from something which can be fixed to something that almost becomes, in essence, who they are. And I have argued in print elsewhere that you do see elements of that, where the rabbis of the Babylonian Talmud tend to see poverty as what I call a sticky identity. It's not that nothing can be done about it, but it's sticky. It's very difficult to shake. It's difficult to get out of. And that's part of the reason I think that this anxiety around really differentiating between the poel, the wage laborer, and the slave. These people, we don't want that. We don't want that overlap to occur. We don't want that category slippage really to occur. But I mean, this is, I would say, tzarich iyun. It requires more investigation. It's the right question, and more needs to be done to look into it.
Yeah, there could be I don't know, if not a master's thesis, at least a solid paper in that.
Could be.
Could be. Okay, I'm just going to double check the chat for questions. Feel free to.
I have a question. Sorry.
Oh, please speak.
Yeah, so a minute ago when we were saying that, one of the reasons you can sell a Torah scroll, well, we're not even mentioning redeeming captives like that. That's just so obvious. Would it be equally obvious that you could do it to give tzedakah to poor people?
Well, that's a good question. One thing I would say here is that sort of reasoning falls into the don't try this at home category. In other words, there are certain sages who could probably, quote unquote, get away with that, and not everybody can. I mean, I've seen examples where the great Tosaphist in the 12th century, the great Torah scholar, Rabbeinu Tam, the grandson of Rashi, uses that kind of reasoning in certain places, but he's Rabbeinu Tam. I'm not sure that this is something that can be sort of a do-it-yourself phenomenon, but that's why I find it so interesting that Binyamin Ze'ev does it. And it has here also, I would say, a hortatory, an exhortative tone. Of course, it's obvious. You're even asking me. It's his way also. It's rhetorical, in other words. It's a way of reinforcing just how significant, important, and crucial the underlying mitzvah is. But yes, I'm not here saying that this is necessarily a do-it-yourself approach to the legal extrapolation from these texts, but I hear you.
I mean, I wasn't going to go to the shul president and say, look, we've got to sell Torah scrolls.
Well, no, yeah, I mean, they're hard to get, yeah. But I would say it's noteworthy when we see this used, because it says something about the value of what is at issue to the scholar using this form of argumentation. It tells us something. That's where I would sort of leave it. It tells us something about how important a value, whatever it is that they're willing to go to that kind of argumentation, which frankly is not a great argument. There are many reasons why something's missing from a text. That's not an obvious reason why something's missing from a text.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gray, for joining us for another class. It's a pleasure to have you come and teach next week as well. Thank you.
Looking forward. Have a good day.